Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is the first webinar of the year, I assume, for Pluralsight. It's definitely my first of the year. Hope you all had a great holiday break. Today, I wanted to go through Angular from scratch. So some of you out there may have done Angular before, and this will be a little bit of a refresher over some things and might give you an update to some of the newer features and to some of the tooling, because anybody who's seen me present before knows I like to show off different tooling, especially inside of VS Code. And if you've never done Angular before, no worries, because we're going to start right from the beginning. And we're going to show you the 4 or 5 core things that you need to know when you jump into Angular. And that will be something you'll use in every Angular application. So with that, let's get started here. And quick reminder that I'll be taking a lot of questions, so feel free to enter them into the tool and we will answer those towards the end of the presentation. Quick aside, if you're looking for any information weekly, I run a podcast called Real Talk JavaScript. You can find that here at realtalkjs.com. We have plenty of Pluralsight authors who join us there too. So what's the topic today? Angular. And we're first going to start with creating your first app using the Angular CLI. There's other ways to create Angular apps from scratch without using any of the tooling. But if you've done it without the tooling, which, it's a good thing to try, it's much more painful than using some of the tools. Whether using React, Vue, or Angular, they all have a CLI these days, and they all make it easier just to get started, to get the right files in the right places. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to cover 2 topics together. There's the topic of components, which are really, they're the bread and butter. They're the core foundation of Angular. And we're going to cover how those work and then how modules play into those components. Then we're going to dive a little bit deeper inside the components and touch on the data bindings and the template syntax and what a component looks like, and then how you can make it behave the way you want it to. We'll also cover services. There's a lot of reusable type of code we need to use, and services are a great way to do that. And then we'll touch on HTTP, how we can go get data across the network. So creating your first app. This is something that if you've never done before, I think you'll appreciate the tools that we're about to show. So how this could work for you in setting things up. But before we show a tool, I don't like to just show the how. I like to discuss the why. So what makes setting up a new app so difficult? And it is, quite frankly. Gone are the days when we simply just grabbed a CDN, a JavaScript file off a CDN and a script tag, plopped it on a page, and we were off to the races coding. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of those are that we need a build system. Like if you pull your JavaScript down into a script tag, how do you minimize all that code? How do you make it really performant? How do you bundle that code up so you're not making 50 HTTP requests to get those script tags? How do you make sure they're not in the right order? This is where we need tooling to help us get there. So getting that tooling in place is important. This helps us create that optimized build. Using a new app, when you start it, I don't know about you, but staring at a blank tool like Visual Studio or Code or WebStorm, any of those, when it's just blank, it's like, all right, what files do I need again? And how often do you create new apps? Maybe once every couple of months when you're at your job? Maybe once a week if you're just doing it on the side and playing around with open source. But you may not always remember every file. If you ever want to ask an Angular developer a quiz, ask them quick to identify every file that's in the root of an Angular app. I'll bet you most of them can't do that off their head without looking at something. You'll get some, but not all. So the tooling helps us get all that and organize the project structure, make sure the files are in the right places. You can follow certain style guide conventions out of the box that come with Angular, and you can also look those up on the Angular docs, and it gives you testing and other conventions. So really, in short, the CLI makes it easy to create an app that just follows the best practices right out of the box. I've often said the hardest thing about Angular isn't Angular. It's getting to a running app. It's the stuff that you need to set up a running app. And the nice thing about this is the CLI removes all that friction. It just says, create my app, let me go code. So quickly, what do you need before you get started? Well, you want to install Node because that's what the Angular CLI runs with. And you can get that from this link here. And I recommend that you get the LTS version for your operating system. And then you run this command, npm install -g for global, Angular CLI. If you're not familiar with LTS, it stands for long-term support. Currently, Node is in LTS with version 12. You can always find out what version is LTS by clicking on the Node.js org page right here from this link. So once we have the CLI, we can run a command like this, ng new hello and -- defaults. What this does is it sets up a brand new app. ng is the Angular CLI. We're saying run the CLI, create a new app called hello, and we're passing parameters and saying just use the default settings. Then once it creates that, we can cd into that folder, and then we can run the app and serve it right inside of our browser by running npm start. So let's go do a quick demo and show how this can work. So back in, we're going to go into a terminal. You'll see something here I did just to save a little bit of time. I'm going to zoom in. So right here in my app, you'll see at the top, there's a command, ng new hello. And then I did style sass and add routing. And then I added a couple other options here. I'll explain what some of these options mean for us. So -- style means we're going to use Sass or CSS or less. I happen to like Sass, so I'm telling it to do that. -- routing means add some routing out of the box. So it's going to set up our app to have more than one page. If you ever want to have an app that has more than one page in it, you're going to want routing. So while you can create one without it, I recommend you create one with it from the beginning because it's just easier, because most apps need more than one page. And then the other two options are optional. But I like these because what they mean is -s means put all the styles inside of the TypeScript file. And -t means put all the HTML inside the TypeScript file. So instead of getting back, you can see down here in this list, instead of getting back an HTML file and a TypeScript file and a Sass file, you're just going to get back a TypeScript file for every component. So down here on this line where it says hello source app.component.ts, that file there is our component. Now let's go ahead and create a default one just to see what things look like. We're in this play folder, do ng new, and we'll call this a simple app. And then I'm going to say -- defaults like that. Now when it goes and creates that, you're going to see it run through and create the files. Notice as it's generating and going off the internet to install everything, it's got 4 different files for the component. Down here, the app component has a CSS, HTML, a spec, which is our test, and a TypeScript file. So it's got 4 of those. My other app that I created only had a TypeScript file and a spec for the test. It got rid of the CSS and HTML and basically embedded them inline inside of the TypeScript file. It's just a preference that I like to have where I put them all in one file, but you can also spread them out if you want to. It's one of the nice things about the CLI is it gives you these options. So now if we cd into simple app, and let's go ahead and open this up inside of editor, just look what it gave us. Here's my source code. You can see the app. Notice I have HTML in here. Tell it not now. Here's the basic HTML file it's giving us. And then it gave us this component, and it gave us an empty CSS file. Now if I get out of here, and let's go back to the terminal, we're going to go back into the other project that we created, which was called hello. And we'll open that one up inside of code. You'll see a slight difference. Make this a lot bigger because we're really looking at the left side. Notice in the app folder, we have an app component. Now the app component has all of our HTML right here inside this template. And there's a lot of HTML by default. We don't need all of this, so I'm going to start deleting it to make it easier to read. Boom, 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 like that. So let's look at the anatomy here, what's in the component. First, we're pulling in this thing called component here on line 3. Let's minimize that just to make it easier again. This @ component is what's called a decorator. The decorator is what describes the thing that follows it. The decorator is a function. There's a component function here saying, hey, pass these parameters, and this is what defines app component. Let's look at those parameters. First parameter is a selector, which tells it this is the name of the HTML element that you'll use. So inside of our HTML, we would type something like this to actually use this component. And what does this component have? It has this HTML inside of it. So it's got this div, which has a heading 1, and it's got this router outlet, which we'll learn about later. And if we had any CSS, we could put them right inside of here. And then finally, you'll see the components down here, and it's got data. This is a model called title. The title says hello. It says welcome to hello. Well, we could say something like this. We could say Pluralsight. And then if I ran this app, it would say welcome to Pluralsight right here. Now you can see one of the things I like about showing the template, which is lines 5 through 12, and then showing the styles, which is line 13, all in the same file with the code, which is down here in lines 15 through 17, is now you can get one view in one file of what a component looks like. Now, if you want to spread these out across multiple files, this is where you would omit that -s and -t from the CLI commands. Just to show you again real quick, opening up a terminal, run ng new, your new app, and if I do something like this, -t, that means put the templates in line. That says put the template right in this file. And -s means put the styles right in this file. That's what gives us this functionality. When we omit those, we're going to have a separate TS, HTML, and CSS file. All right, so let's run our app quick. Now that we've got this hello, we should be able to run npm start. Well, if you're not sure what that is, let's go to the package.json over here, and you can see it says right there, go ahead and start this application, and it's running the command ng serve. Now, if you ever get this error, you might see this at times. Port 4200 is already in use. What's happened here is I'm running more than one Angular app on my machine right now. And I like to show errors just in case, because these things will happen. This means there's already somebody using this port. And this is the port on your browser, on your machine, that Angular uses by default. We can override that by setting --port. So what I'm going to do here is say npm start, and I'm going to pass in parameters. I use the double dash to do that. And the parameter I'm going to pass in is port, because that's what it told me. I'm going to use 4201. So now it's building that. It's running ng serve port 4201. You'll see it build our application. And when it's done, the application will look like this down here, which is compiled successfully. We can flip over to our browser or run to localhost 4201. And there is our amazing first application inside of Angular. All right, when you're done, you just come back into the terminal and you hit Control-C, and you can get rid of that. So let's go back to the slides. We kind of saw quickly what this app looks like and how to get started, but I whizzed through a bunch of concepts that if you're new to Angular, you probably never heard before. So let's take a step back now, and let's look at what those different things were. And I like to start by looking at the structure of an application. So first, you saw an application that we generated that looked like this. And over on the left there, you can see this is where the source code of our application gets created, inside this source app folder. So the source app folder is our source code. And inside there, there's 4 files. The app module, which we'll learn about in a moment, is our manifest or our list of everything in our app. The app component is the first component that loads inside of our web page. And the components are the visual pieces of information that we see on the screen. The app component in our case was the entire page. The spec file, which we weren't using at the time, is a test. So you can test your components. And then the last one is the routing module. So we just told it to set up routing, which means we can have more than one page in our app, and that's where the routing module goes. What if you have images or fonts? You put those in the assets folder and it will automatically deploy those for you, which is great. And then there's these 2 files down there called index.html and main.ts. These are the starting point of the app. When the app cranks up, the index.html is the base page that loads. And this page contains our app component. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And then the main.ts is what kicks off Angular in the page. So you can imagine there's an index.html page, and then there's a script tag in that, which basically runs the main.ts, which kicks off Angular. And then down at the bottom, there's a package.json file. This is where all of our dependencies for our application lives and our scripts. So Angular is listed in there because we're using that. And then there's scripts like that npm start script that we took a quick look at. There's a lot of other files here, but these are the core ones that you really need to take a look at. So we go back into our application over here. Let's take a look at those files. Here's our main.ts. When things get kicked off, You don't really have to know what's going on here other than what happens on line 11. What we're saying here is Angular's telling you, look, go ahead and load the browser platform, which is Angular's components. And then it's saying bootstrap this module, means start running it. And the module it's going to start with is app module. App module is the default module that comes out of the box. So let's go look at this app module, which is inside the app module file. So Angular starts up, it says start Angular, then it says go look in this file for everything you need to load. Notice here it's saying that it should bootstrap this app component. Well, that's our base component. And what features do I want in my app? I want to run with browser functionality. Angular lets you run with that. And then any routing that I might have set up. Let's go look at that app component. Here's our app component that we looked at before. Notice this is our component, and that's why it shows up and says hello world, welcome to Pluralsight when it starts. And this app root up here in the selector, that's really important. Let's open up a second window, and we'll open up index.html here. Notice line 11 on index.html on the right-hand side matches the selector on line 4 in the app component. This app root selector, which is just an HTML tag, tells Angular, okay, there's something called app-root. Go look in the component list and find a component that matches that selector and then use that one and load it. So that's why we give these components a selector name. And we prefix them so they don't run into naming collisions. For example, what if you called your selector something like div? That would be the world's worst selector name ever, because guess what, everybody? Now the browser thinks, well, wait a minute, are you trying to load the Angular div or are you trying to load the div that's baked in every browser? So we generally like to have a prefix like this, and app dash is a convention, and you can rename it to anything. If you work at a company called Acme, you could use Acme dash. All right, let's go back to our slides. So that app module is really important. I like to say it's a manifest. It's basically the list of everything that's inside of our module, or in this case, our application too. So what does that thing contain? It contains everything our app needs to know to start. So we create this @ng module, that's another decorator, and that's a function. We're saying, okay, this function says this file, this class called app module is an ng module, and I want to declare that there's these two components in it, app component and a heroes component, which we're going to create. And then we want to import browser functionality and my router functionality. Now I might have hundreds of components in my app, so which one do I want to start with? I want to start with app component. So here's all the things that I want to declare inside my app. I'm declaring them and importing these features. So the module is, again, just a manifest, nothing visual about it on the screen for the users, but it helps Angular and you organize your app. What about a component? Well, we took a look at a very simple component here that was called app component, but what would a heroes component look like? It might look like something like this, where the selector is now app heroes. And the selector is the name of the element we're going to see on the page inside the HTML. And then the template URL can point to the location of the HTML that this template and this component uses. Now notice it says template URL. That's how we would use this if we want to point the HTML to another file. If you want to embed the HTML in this file, we would just say template, not template URL. And we'll take a look at that. And finally, you'll see there's a hero model down inside the class. The hero model is data. So you might hear model a lot, but that just means there's data in your app. And we might want to fill that with our hero's first name, last name, and superpowers. So let's go create a component. Inside of our app, we're going to open up the terminal. Now I'm hitting Command J to open my terminal up down below, or you can hit Control and then the tick mark, which will do that as well. Once you've got that, notice I'm in the Play Hello folder. I can do ng, and then I can do generate component. What do I want to call this component? I want to call it heroes. So I'm just going to run that command right here, and it's going to create these two files for me. Notice it created the component TS and the spec TS, but it also updated the app module. Let's go ahead and look at what it did to the app module. Notice in the app module, it added the declaration for heroes component right there in line 11, and it imported the file for us. which is really nice. To show you, if you ever want to like play around with this, there's a much quicker way to do it. I want to create a new file called villains for another component. I can actually just say ngc villains. G means generate and C means component. So that's just a much shorter way to generate components. And here's a special flag I like to do. -D means dry run or practice. If I do that, it doesn't actually generate the files. It just tells you what it's going to generate. Notice there's no villains folder over here on the left. And then once I know that's what I want, I can just do the command like this without the -D. And now I've got my heroes and I've got my villains over here. So what's inside the heroes component? If we open that up, there's our heroes component file. Notice the template is embedded. It doesn't say template URL because it's not pointing to another file. The HTML is right here inside my page. We can say something like this is our heroes page. Well, technically it's a component. And then we can put styles in here if we want them. We have a constructor, and ng on init is a special function that basically is where you put your code for startup. So anything you want to do when you start up goes there. Awesome. Now inside the app component itself, we're not actually showing that hero yet. So we can show that too. One more thing we can do to get there is inside this hero, we could use the router, but for now, we're going to use that selector we created, which should create app heroes like that. Now let's make sure that that's what it's called. Right here on line 4, it's called app heroes. And that's what it's called over here. If we go back to our application running, and we're not actually running, so that's a good hint. We can go back and run npm start on the port, and then we'll just keep this running so we don't have to do that again. Once it's running, we should be able to see our heroes on the page. And we'll refresh, and this is our heroes component right over here. Perfect. Okay, looking back at the slides, we've kind of seen how we add components to our application. The next step is to look at what can we do inside those components. And there's quite a bit actually. So I call this section template syntax. The first thing you might want to do is once you have data, you want to display text on the screen. So we use these curly braces and wrap our model with it. So here we might say hello hero. In this case, the hero is an object and has a name property. And that there is just known as interpolation. We interpolate, or we basically render the value of the hero.name model on the screen. So it would say, hello, John. And that's read-only data. Then we could do one-way property binding. So sometimes we want to show an image, like we might get a customer's image path as a part of a model. And then to render that, we normally would use the image source attribute, but in this case, we're going to wrap it with these square brackets. That's the syntax we use when we have property binding. We can take any HTML property, wrap it with the square brackets, and then bind it to a model. And this is going to go get that image from wherever that path happens to be. So wrap any DOM property that you want, and you can also use dot syntax. Notice I'm doing customer.imagePath, which means you can also do things like disabled. You could have a model that says, hey, is it enabled or not? And then set the disabled property for the button. Or you could do something like an ARIA label. So if you want to have accessibility in your app, you could set your text model to the ARIA label by wrapping that with the square braces. And you could also even set like the styles color if that needs to be dynamic as well. So it's pretty cool what you can do inside those one-way property bindings. The next key is two-way binding. If you're using forms in your app to gather data, you'll want this. So let's say we have a hero first name and it's shown in the input, and the user types the value of first name. It should change, but where? It should change on the screen, and it should change inside your component's code. So if I change John to Ella, we want to make sure it's not only changed to Ella on the screen, but our component's hero has a first name of Ella. And the way you do that is we set up our, let's say it's labels and inputs. We set up our input in this case to use ng model. ng model is a special attribute that Angular gives us, which we say, instead of using the value property, in this case of the input, we say, okay, take the ng model and then set that to hero first name. Now, you might be wondering here, if we go through that, why don't I have to use square brackets here? So I'm going to show you why that works. In and we're gonna do this right in the slide, not the code, just to show how it works. If I could do this, that would be nice, where I've got this square bracket syntax. I want to make it blue because I like blue. There we go. So that would normally mean, okay, take the ng model property that the DOM exposes and make it a property. But there is no ng model property. So there's actually a special syntax in Angular to do this. And that is this weird syntax here. Basically, you wrap ng model inside of parentheses and then inside of a square bracket. It's a weird syntax. You might ask why. We'll learn more about that in very shortly. But it is one of the stranger syntaxes in Angular, but effectively it gives you a shortcut to having two-way data binding inside of Angular. So ng model is great for us. We get to have that two-way binding. All right, about to get our answer on why those parentheses. Now imagine that a user clicks a button. We want to be able to do something when that button is clicked, and that do something might be running a function in our component. So what we do is we can wrap the click event with the parentheses. So we say, all right, what's the target of our user's input or event? It might be click or on blur or something else like that. So the implementation of this might look like this. We've got a button, and when you click that button, the top one's the no button, the bottom was the yes. We want to run the on no function that's in our component. So here, when the button is clicked, we want to call on yes, just like that. Now you might see why the ng model has both the square brackets and the parentheses, because the ng model is showing the property. It's using a one-way binding to show the property of the name on the screen, but it's also listening for any changes in that input, which is an event, thus the parentheses, which then saves it back down to our component. So two more things that we want to show inside of a template. Quite often you're going to want to show a list, like a list of heroes or a list of customers. And to do that, there's a special attribute called ng4. This is a directive called ng4. Now, they give this particular directive an asterisk because that means it's a structural directive. ng model was another directive we saw. That one's just binding data. It's not changing the structure of our page. ng4 is going to add a list to our page. So the star means it's structural. This is going to repeat the HTML content for every item in our list. So imagine we have a list of heroes. We've got this page. We've got a table. We're going to say ng4, let hero of heroes. Heroes is our array of heroes. And we're saying, go ahead and let hero be the iterator that represents every hero in the list. And then for each one of those rows, we're going to get a new TD, a column that says hero.firstname or hero.last name. So we're combining a couple things here. We're combining both the ng4, which gets our list of heroes and iterates over that row, and then we're combining that with the interpolation to show that we can then show the name of the hero inside of that row for the table. So in the end, if we have 10 heroes, we'll have 10 table rows. Very common to use this. Also very common is the ngIf. This one is also a structural directive. This lets you decide, do you want to show content or not on the page? So we're going to set the ngIf directive to an expression that generally evaluates the true or false. So you might say something like this. If you've got a list of heroes above this HTML, if nobody's selected a hero yet, maybe you don't want to show some details. So you might have this div below that list where it says ngIf only show it if selected hero. Well, what is selected hero? Selected hero might be the actual hero somebody selected from the list above. And if it has a value, it's truthy. That's a way of saying it's got a value. Then it's going to show this entire div that says you selected hero.firstname. If nobody selected hero yet, it's probably undefined or null. In that case, the ngIf would then say this is falsy, there's nothing to show, and the entire div would not evaluate nor would it display. So we learned quite a bit about the template syntax that's in this page. One last one that I'd like to show is about class bindings. This is an easy thing you can do where you can say, I want to set a CSS class. And maybe what I want to do is I want to add the class called active to the page whenever isActive is true. So again, we're using the dot syntax, but we can also add multiple classes in one shot. Again, there's a special directive called ngClass. We wrap that with the property syntax because we're only sending it to the browser. And what this syntax says is here, if is active, if is active is true. Is active is a model in our component. Then apply this class to our CSS in this page. So we have a class called foo. So it's going to add that class. Now, likewise, if is disabled is true in our model, it's also going to add the bar class to our CSS in the page. So what's nice about this syntax of the ngClass is it evaluates each expression inside those curly braces separately, so it can add or remove classes as you need. All right, a quick summary, because there's a lot of template syntax. First, the curly braces with a model. That is called interpolation, and that's our one-way presentation of data from a component to the screen. Then, if we want to bind to a DOM property, like the source of an image or an href for an anchor tag, we could just wrap it with these square brackets. If we want to have like a click event or any other kind of event, we just wrap that event with the parentheses and then tell it which event to run in our component. ng model is our two-way data binding. ng if is our conditional for our if statements, and ng for is how we iterate over a loop. So that was quite a bit to look at. Let's go add some code that kind of uses this. And our app is still running inside of our app component. Now we have our heroes component, and just to refresh your memories, there's our heroes component there. Inside of heroes, let's do a couple things. And let's create, first of all, a heroes array, and we'll set it equal to a couple values. Let's create an ID, give the person 10, and we'll do name is John, like that. And I'm going to use some VS Code magic to put a comma after it and just copy and paste. And give them different IDs. And we'll change this one to Ella. We'll do Haley, and we'll do Madeline. So this is our list of heroes on the page. Next, we want to show these heroes. Just to show how this works, let's go inside of our template, and after this p tag, let's put a div down here. And then let's, in between those, for right now, just show what happens if we put heroes right there. Object, 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 or just blah, blah, blah. What that means is that it's showing an object and it can't figure out what to do. Well, just for debugging, there's a special filter. We can say heroes pipe character JSON. And now we can see that's the actual data on the screen. Now, obviously, we don't want our app to look exactly like that. And since I'm at it, I might as well show you another little trick. If we wrap this with a pre, it'll actually look better, so you can actually look at this code. That's a nice way you can kind of experiment and say, am I getting my data? Is it coming across? So we don't want the heroes to look like that. Instead, we want to show a list of the heroes. So let's create a UL on our page. And after that UL, we're going to create an LI like this. Now, normally we want to put in here something like there's my first value, there's my second value, like this. And you end up with these different dots, and then the different heroes will show up below there. So you want to say John, Ella, Haley, Madeline, etc. Well, we don't need to repeat every single value by hard coding it. Instead, we want to use is one of these NGs. So in here, what we can do is we can use the syntax for the ng for. So I can do ng for equals, go like this. We say let hero of heroes, like that. Now, before I change anything else, there's the B right there. Let's see what happens on the screen. We have 4 Bs. This makes sense because we have 4 elements in the heroes. It's iterating over each one of those. But now I want to show hero.name. And there's a typo there, but let's see what happens. Now we get hero name. What we want to do is interpolate that. So I wrap this with the squiggly braces like that. And if it saves it, there we go. It re-renders and shows us now there's a list of our heroes, John, Ella, Haley, and Madeline, just like that. So here we've seen how we can have a list like this here. Now, what if we also wanted to put a name in there and we want to change it? Let's create an input element right here. And let's just give it a value attribute, and we'll default that to Colleen. We'll create that right here. Now we've got this person up here that's listed, and we want to do type equals text just to be clear it's there. And there's Colleen. So we don't want to hard code this either. What we really want to do is we want this to be bound to a property. Let's say this is going to be, I'm going to put title in there, and we'll make this a string, and we'll set a default to, I don't know, let's call it webinar, because that's what we're in. It's still not showing up there. So the way we make it show up is we go up into this and we use that ng model we talked about. So remember, first square brackets, then the parentheses, ng model, and then we go over here and we say, all right, let's give it a title, and that's going to be the title for that ng model. Now you might get an error, and this is a funky error you're going to see once in a while. It says I can't bind ng model since it's not a known property of input. Angular doesn't pull things in unless you absolutely need them. So this is a form element, and a form element is something that allows you to have inputs and bindings, and your app may not always have that. So Angular doesn't always bring that in, but you can easily add it to your application. So we're going to add that a little later. I'm going to show you how to do that, but for now, let's just take that one out of here because we don't need that one to be there for this time. All right, last thing we should do is a click. So on the LI up here, let's say we want to select the hero, and when we select the hero, we want to know who it was. So we're going to put a click event in here, if I could spell click, and we want to run, let's just call it OK. That's going to be our OK button right there. And we'll come down here, and we're going to create a function called OK. And for now, let's just do a really ugly alert window to say, I got here. And then when we click on one of these, we can see the alert right there says, I got here. Now we never want to do an alert, so let's get rid of that. But when we click OK, what we really want to know is which one of these heroes did we select? So what we can do is we can pass in hero. So we can say, all right, we're going to pass in hero right there, and we'll give it a type of hero if we had our TypeScript classes. In our case, we're just going to say, hey, that's an any, just kind of getting away with it for now because we haven't typed these. And then what we can do is we can do something with that value. So here we could say selected hero, we're creating a new property, is equal to hero. And it would be this dot selected hero. Well, notice it's red. It doesn't know where that came from. So it doesn't exist. If we hit the command plus, it's giving us a hint saying you can actually add this to a property. So we're going to say declare the property selected hero. And notice line 25. It added that selected hero for us. So now when we look at our code, we can run through here and we select it. What's actually happening under the covers is it's creating that selected hero. So if I do something like a console.log selected hero.name, we'll see as I select Ella, there's Ella showing up over here on the right-hand side. Now I can click on Madeline and she shows up. So what I could do then is then take this div and right below it, let's create another div. We'll use that ngIf and say, all right, if you selected somebody, let's show them. So here's a div. So you selected, and we'll put in here, selected hero.name, and we'll use an ngIf. And the ngIf should simply just say, hey, if there's a value for selected hero, and I want to spell it with the right way, we want to show it. This div should not even show up if there's no selected hero. So now we click on Madeline, we can see that, Haley, Ella, John. If I refresh the page, you don't see that you selected. In fact, it's not even in the DOM at this point. So we saw here a couple of different things. We saw the interpolation, we saw the ng-for, the ngIf, the click, and we also saw we can define our data inside of our component. Well, we're going to progress a little bit forward now and think about, I did a couple of things in there that I probably wouldn't recommend long-term. So one of the things I did I wouldn't recommend long-term is I explicitly configured my data inside of my component. What does that mean? I hard-coded it. The heroes shouldn't be hard-coded in my component. They should go off and get the data from somewhere. Well, the first step to that is to use something called services. Services are a great way to have reusable code in your application and then use those in any component you want. Imagine that you've got a service that goes and gets heroes, or you might have a service that logs, or another service that does error handling for you. All those could be services that are reused in your app. For us, we might have a service called Hero Service, and the Hero Service might look like this. Notice on the left, we have the structure of a class, and that structure says, okay, export the class called Hero Service. The Hero Service is the name of the class, and it's got a function called get heroes. You can imagine it's returning an array of heroes there. Just the ... is the same heroes we had before. There's some things here that are a little less comfortable or familiar with that if you haven't done Angular before. And that first piece is the inject. This @injectable is another decorator, which is a function, remember, and it operates on the thing that follows it. So this @injectable function is operating on the hero service. So we're telling Angular here is this hero service on its own, there's no way for Angular to know this class is a service unless you tell it this is a service. The way you do that is you say this hero service is injectable and I want to provide it in the root. What does that mean? It means that this service is going to be provided in the root of our application. We're going to tell Angular with this one line of code that this hero service exists in the application. That's what it does for us. So provided in root is the recommended default. There's other options you can do here, and if you have multiple modules, you can tell it which module to put it in. But I'm going to tell you 99% of the time you're going to provide in the root, and you'll be pretty safe there. Okay, so once you create this hero service and you tell it to go get your heroes, which imagine it just again gets a list of Ella, Madeline, Colleen, etc. How do you actually use that from your component? Glad you asked. So inside of our heroes component, we might have a list of customers or heroes or whatever. And actually, that should just say heroes. Yep. Let's just retype that. There we go. So we've got a list of heroes, which is a hero array. Now notice the constructor on the third line. That constructor says private hero service, : hero service. The important part here is the thing after the colon. That hero service type is what we had on the previous page right here. So we told Angular on this page that a thing exists called hero service. Now we need to use it. In our component, the way our component gets it is we pass the hero service to the constructor. And we named it locally hero service with a lowercase h. We could have named it foo if we wanted to. So now this hero service is available inside of our component. And we can say this.hero service get heroes, goes off and gets the heroes, brings it back to our local heroes array. And guess what? You're using dependency injection now. Angular has this built into it. And the reason this exists is you don't have to go figure out, do I need to new up my class, my hero service class? Does it already exist? If I only want one of these hero services existing, and I want everybody to use it, which is great for services that go do things for me, then I can just say, use dependency injection to tell Angular, hey, Angular, I want a thing called hero service. And it's going to say, give me a sec, John. I'm going to go look and see who was provided to me in the root using that @injectable. And if there's one that matches hero service, I know I can give it to you. And the second step is, does it already exist? If not, it'll create a new instance and then give it to me. And if it does exist, it'll give me the already existing instance. All that magic behind the scenes is done for us. All we have to do, create the class, provide it in the root, and then inject it into the constructor, and we're good. So it automatically finds the service. The service discovery works with the DI system. The last piece is we still don't want to hard code or explicitly configure our heroes. We want to go get them dynamically. So we're going to use HTTP. We don't just want to move the heroes from the component to the service. We want to move the need to the service to go get the heroes, and then the service has to use HTTP to get it. So to make HTTP requests, we do something like this. We create an injectable class like we saw before, and then we give it a constructor, and we're injecting HTTP client. This is a class that comes with Angular. Angular gives us the ability to go make HTTP calls, and it gives a bunch of extra features on top of these, so like stuff headers and things into it if we want to, or intercept HTTP traffic or cancel it, not cancel it, sorry, change the data that comes back, interrogate the response or the request. So the HTTP client is effectively a supercharged HTTP fetch. So we get the HTTP and then we simply say in the service, go get the heroes. And we do return this HTTP, that's our service that came from Angular, dot get, that's the method that we're going to use because you get, post, put, delete, etc. And then we're giving it the generic type of hero array because we're telling it this is going to come back with a list or an array of type hero. And then we simply pass it the URL to go get them from, and it returns what we need. So all of that is done there for us out of the box. We can just go get the hero, and then there's other options you can pass to for headers and things. If you wanted to change this to a post, you could do a post, or you can make it a delete, depending on what you want to do inside your application. So we're going to flip forward to another app at this point, and I'm going to give you your URL to this app too. This one's called Vikings, because Vikings can be heroes too. And inside this app, which is already running, which is why I had an app running before, we'll refresh it. Here's our list of Vikings. So we got Ragnar and Ivar and Bjorn and a bunch of people here. With these Vikings, we can select them, and then it goes and gets the details. We can change the names and put in like ones after it, and it updates our list over here. We can add more and then cancel, or we can come back here and delete them and press save. The trash can will delete somebody, so if we want to get rid of Bjorn, bye Bjorn. Bjorn would go away, and we can also add new heroes if we want to. So we can put in Foo and Bar as a new hero, and then our data would come back. And oh, we're not using a real database. I'm using an in-memory database, so it doesn't exactly exist here right now. So we've got all of our heroes in this case. Try to refresh the page. There is our list again. It just gets reset. So I'm using an in-memory database, so we don't actually have to have a database to run this demo. All right, so what does this look like? We just talked about using services in HTTP. Inside of this application, I've got a hero and a villain folder. Let's look at the heroes, and here's our hero service. So get rid of some noise on the page. And inside this hero service, you'll notice we're using injectable provided in root. And then here's our hero service itself. And then it's injecting this HTTP client. Where does that come from? We scroll up, we can see we're importing HTTP client from Angular Common HTTP. Where does that come from? If we go back to our app module, which by the way, what I'm doing here is hitting Command P. I'm going to type app module like that, then hit enter. It'll find the file for me. You'll notice here there's an HTTP client module that I'm importing on line 4. And then I tell Angular, not only do I want the browser, but I want this HTTP client module in our application. What it does, it adds that functionality to the app, so it has this HTTP client, which means I can import it into my service and use this HTTP symbol to say, go get from whatever this API is, which is /API. There's a logout. Here's a get for profile. Here's a get for heroes. So we can do all these great HTTP calls inside of our service. Well, who's using the service? If we right-click and we choose Find All References, VS Code will tell us the hero service is referenced in the hero service, and it's referenced in our component. So let's look at the component. There's an import statement on line 5, and then down below in the constructor on line 21, it's where it's injecting the hero service. That's it. We want to use the hero service in this component, we just inject it in the constructor. If another component wants this service, we inject it in that constructor too. And you can have as many of these you want. Let's say it also needed a logger. Here we just say private logger, and it was called logger service. We would name it like that. That's all we'd have to do. And then we can just make our our HTTP calls to get heroes or delete hero or anything we want that's in that service. We can do a delete hero right there. Here's our get heroes, and it just goes and gets our data. Now you might be wondering, why is get heroes being called, but nothing's happening? Like it's not using return values. Well, let's look inside this get heroes function. The hero service gets the heroes, but this is asynchronous. So we can't just set equal to something like this. It'd be nice to say heroes equals this service get heroes. That's not going to work because when you hover over get heroes, you're going to see it returns back this observable of hero array. Whoa, what's that? Well, what you really need to know is an observable is something that watches the response in this case and waits for you to get back the list of heroes. So it's observing it. It's using a technology called RxJS. If you're not familiar with that, all you need to know at this point is that get heroes is asynchronous, and the way you get to the heroes is you use this pipe character. Sorry, use this subscribe character here. We'll get to pipe in a moment. Use the subscribe method, which gets the heroes and uses an arrow function in this case to say, now set my heroes, this dot heroes is the components heroes, equal to what I came back with. To make this easier to see, let's just say I call these the Johns, and because that's my name, and they come back. So this value here matches what's on the right-hand side, and this is what's in our component, which should be defined up here on line 18. That's how we get our heroes out of HTTP. So I'm going to name them back the heroes like that. If you're not familiar with the arrow syntax like this, I can break it out a little bit and show you how this would work. This is a longer syntax still with arrows. What the arrows are really saying is this. Hey, this is a function and it's going to pass heroes to us. And the heroes are a hero array, capital H, like that. So we're saying when you subscribe, basically when the data comes back, call this function. You're going to give it the heroes. That's what HTTP is doing. And then we can say, now set your heroes to my local set of component heroes, and we're good to go. And that's how it gets those. And the arrow function is just a much shorter way of saying that syntax like this. Now what the pipe does is the pipe says that when we're done, we want to call the finalize function and turn off our progress indicator. So the pipe is a way you can tap into this asynchronous event to know when it's done. That way I can turn loading on, and then when I'm done, I can turn loading off. As you might imagine, I've got an ngIf on this component that's looking at this loading model. And when it's set to true, I show the progress indicator. When it's set to false, it goes away. So if you go look at heroes component.html, inside our page here, you can see I've got a ngIf heroes right there. And then I'm passing those heroes into a page that I can use to show them. So really, we're just saying, go get the heroes, subscribe. When done, get those heroes here. If I want to simplify this, what I could do is get rid of the progress indicator and the unselect, and there's a single line of code to get my heroes. Call the service, get the heroes. When it's done, subscribe, and take those heroes and put them into a model so my component can use them. Excellent. And then when you're done, you get our application that we just saw here. We click on our heroes, and there's our list of heroes. So you've seen quite a bit in this application. The last thing we haven't seen is routing. And you'll notice there's 2 routes in our app. To use the routing, it's very easy because it's set up out of the box. But all you have to do to define your paths is something like this. Now, you set up a path for every component you want. You say the path is called home and the component is called home component. And we get rid of the animations for now. Those are just extra. So basically it says here, if someone goes to /home, call the home component. If someone goes to /heroes, call the hero component. You'll notice up here, I've got heroes in my URL. So what's this load children? Load children says load it dynamically, basically lazy load. We're using the arrow function again. We're going to say go import, find this file called heroes module, and then when you find it, load the heroes module. This is a syntax, it's a little lengthy to type out, that helps you do this. Now, what if you don't remember syntax? Because I'm awful at this. Inside your list of routes, I have a bunch of snippets, which you can use. If you go to VS Code snippets, you type a-path, and you'll see a bunch of paths here. Let's see what happens with default. Notice I type default, it gives me almost exactly what I want for my default path, which you see on line 9. Now, let's say I want to type in a lazy loaded path. Like below, if I type in lazy, I could say, let's say we had heroes, villains, and we also had chickens, which I spelled wrong. Great. That's the path. Then I can type in my lazy loaded path right here and say it's an app-chickens slash chicken.module like that. And then over here, I could say, what's the name of the module? And that's got to be the actual name of the module. It's going to be the chicken module. And that's it. But basically, these snippets give you the syntax for typing in different kinds of routes. You'll see there's a default one, eager and lazy. And then we've got ones with children, which is more advanced, and then a 404. A 404 path is nice because if you take this and you put it last, this means that if anything at all is typed in that I don't recognize, which means it's not villains, it's not heroes, it's not home, it's none of the ones above, load this component here. So why might you need that? Well, what if somebody goes into our application and today they type in heroes, instead of heroes, we're going to type in John Papa. Nothing. There's nothing on the page, but it doesn't really look like an error because I still have my menu and everything else, but I'm not telling the user that there's an error. So if I added that other component down there and I put something in the component, we could actually show a message here like, hey, you might have come here by mistake. Click this link to go back to the home page, for example. So those are the basics of routing in the application. Routing is kind of a bonus in this one. If you want to check out more, you can check it out in this demo right here. Everything I showed, you can check out in the demo at this link, and the instructions for running it are right on this GitHub page. It's called the Vikings demo or Heroes. If you want to run the Angular CLI, you can go to this web page to find the CLI, cli.angular.io. If you want to learn more about how to use the CLI with Angular, I've got a course up here on Pluralsight, and you can use this link here, which you could then open up your Pluralsight subscription if you have one. If you don't, I believe they offer free trials for a certain amount of time. I'll defer to my Pluralsight friends to give details on that. And then because I love VS Code and I want you to have the best tools possible to use to develop with JavaScript applications, I recommend you use VS Code to do that. And if you go to this link here, it'll take you to the main page where you can download it for Linux or Mac or Windows. With that, we kind of whizzed through most of the basics of Angular here in the last hour. We have time for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. I'll defer back to my Pluralsight friends if they feel we have time to do that.
Hey, John. Yeah, we absolutely do have time. I've been assigning questions to you, and you can pop open that question box and take a look at some of those. I think we might have more than 10 to 15 minutes of questions, but it's your call on how you want to jump into these.
All right, let's see how we can go through this here. I'll read them on the fly and see what I can answer. What should be the best practice? All code in a TS file or all separate files? Kapil, thank you for that question. So the default today is to keep them in separate files, TypeScript, HTML, and CSS. And there's some good reasons for that. Today, the tooling really works well when they're in separate files. If you have long HTML, then keeping the template in a separate file is really nice because you get really good tooling inside the HTML files in VS Code and WebStorm and other tools. I expect as time moves on that the Angular language service, which is what Angular develops to make Angular good inside of tools like VS Code, that will begin to be robust so we can put HTML inside of our TS files the way I showed today. Today you can do it, but the tooling isn't as great if you do that. Now styles are a different thing. I like to put my styles inside the TypeScript file because most of the time I don't have styles for every component. And when I do, it's usually just a couple. So I like to embed them in there instead of creating yet another file. If I had my choice, I would put them all in the same file, and I'm hoping and I'm working with the Angular team to see if we can get there. So I got a question from Wayne. If I work on and support many Angular apps over time and may not be able to keep them on the latest version, I'm better off not installing the CLI globally so that I have the correct CLI for the app that was used to create it. It's a great question. So let's say you're working on Angular 7 and now 8's come out and 9's coming out soon. When these different versions come out, how do you keep up? Well, Angular CLI actually puts a local version in your app. So when you're using a global version of the CLI, which is what we installed here today, and then you generate a new app, it also puts a copy of the Angular CLI at the time you generated your app in your package file. Now this is nice because that means that as Angular progresses, your app is committed to whatever version the day you installed it, which means it won't break. But if you want to upgrade it, as Wayne is suggesting here, how do you do that? Well, in that case, the Angular team does a really good job of, let's say you now have an Angular 7 app, but you installed the Angular CLI for version 8. Well, when you do that, will the version 8 CLI globally work with a version 7 app that you created? Yes, it will. So they're doing a really good job of making sure that works because it defers to the version that you have. If you need to actually, let's say there was some kind of a change that you want to upgrade, there's actually a command called ng upgrade, and that one will automatically upgrade your app for you. Actually, I think it's called ng update. I always have to look at that. But what they do is they actually run through your code with that command and they update it to the latest version if you want to, but you don't have to do that. Next question, do we need to add all the components which are in an application to app module TS? If you had one module in your app, yes, all of your components would be declared in that one module. It's a manifest, it's a list of all your components. A more correct answer, I would say, is whatever components you have in your app have to be declared somewhere. The only exception to that is if you're lazy loading a component directly. So in more advanced applications, you might have more than one module in your application. We're not getting into that here today. I think we're doing a follow-up with Pluralsight in a couple months, and I can discuss that further. But yes, if you have one module, all your components have to be declared in that module. Are all URLs relative to the root? Yes, by default they are. Are there built-in project templates in Visual Studio 2019? Mohammed, I believe there are. I don't use Visual Studio for Angular, Vue, or React. I use VS Code for it. You can use Visual Studio for it. I highly recommend you look at WebStorm or VS Code, though, for actual JavaScript projects. Even if you have like an ASP.NET or PHP backend or Java, I recommend using both, meaning you could do ASP.NET inside of Visual Studio and you could do Angular inside of VS Code. But if you want to use both in the same tool, as you're suggesting, I believe there are Visual Studio templates for Angular that you can use. As long as they're using the Angular CLI, I think they're fine. If they're not using the CLI, then you risk the problem of possibly getting out of sync. What's the main difference between Angular, Java, and C#? I got to expand this one. What is Angular used to as opposed to these languages? So Angular is a platform. Angular is more like Java or .NET. Angular uses JavaScript and TypeScript. Angular is a front-end technology that runs inside the browser for the most part. So we run the apps in the browser. The real difference here is if you create an app with, let's say, WinForms or ASP.NET, with ASP.NET, you're generating all your pages on the server and then sending HTML to the client. So every time a page changes, you got to go back to the server, generate the page, and then display it on the client. That's just one approach. With Angular, what's happening here is that you're getting all the code delivered to the browser on the first page, index.html, and then every time you go to a different page, which is a menu item, you're actually just still staying on the browser, and Angular is changing the way the browser looks. So the difference here is there's not a bunch of trips back and forth between the browser and the server with Angular. What VS Code theme and font are John using? I'm using the font Dank Mono, which you can get from dank.sh. That's the website. I think it's 40 or 50 bucks, but it's a really good font. And then my theme is one that I wrote for VS Code called Winter is Coming. And there's a black, blue, and a light version. Why is there a star before ng4 and ngIf, but not ngModel? Great question, Nils. So the ng4 and the ngIf, what do? They change the DOM. They add or remove items from the DOM. ngModel does not do that. ngModel just replaces data values. So any directive with Angular that is structural, where it actually changes the DOM, by convention uses this star syntax. Let's see here. Files inside have an extension of TS. When you create a React app, they have an extension of JS. Can you explain why and what the difference is? Great question. So the JS files mean JavaScript and the TS files mean TypeScript. You can use TypeScript in React or Vue as well, which are other popular frameworks. By default, most React and Vue folks use JavaScript, and that is actually changing quite a bit these days too. TypeScript is something you can use in React and Vue. It's still the minority in those by far, but you can use TypeScript instead of JavaScript. What's the difference? TypeScript gives you static typing and additional tooling features inside the language. So you write TypeScript, which looks like Java or C#, and it generates JavaScript out of that for you, which means that you can use the latest features and have type checking and all the great stuff in TypeScript without worrying about what browser you're supporting, because it will automatically translate it to the right JavaScript version. By including HTML template, the styles and TS in the same file, is this not confusing? What about separation of concerns? This is a choice you can make. I argue that the separation of concerns is still being followed because it's all a component. Concerns aren't HTML versus CSS. To me, the concern is it a hero component? What is it doing? It's handling a hero. It's handling a customer. Could it be confusing? If you had a lot of code in the file, it could be. But I also argue that by separating them out in different files, you have to jump between 3 files all the time, your HTML, your TypeScript, and your CSS. Putting them in the same file, you can just scroll up and down and use what you want in the tooling. It's also a mental reminder for me that I shouldn't have 100 or 200 lines of HTML in a template. If I did that, that's usually a good cue to me to say, maybe I need to have more than one component. But it's definitely a choice. In fact, React and Vue kind of follow the same model. In Vue, you have something called a single file component, which puts the code, JavaScript or TypeScript, CSS, and the HTML all on the same page. And then in React, you have JSX, which combines your code and your HTML on the same page already. What about Vue, React, Redux? Vue and React are other great frameworks that you can use. They're all awesome. I actually love all 3 of these, Angular, React, and Vue. You just got to pick which one is favorite for you. I have a video on the internet that I did about a year ago. It's a half-hour video, kind of goes over the difference between the 3. And if you Google that, you can find it. I believe it was for the .js conference. In the cases selected here, is there a way to let users make a selection via key press rather than mouse click? Absolutely. So I happen to do the click event, but any DOM event can be bound. So you just have to look up inside the HTML spec which of those 20 or 30 events, there's a crazy amount of them, that you can bind to. So you could do on blur, you could do input is another one that you could do. What editors and IDs are good besides VS Code? Well, VS Code is by far my favorite. And I say that not only because I work at Microsoft, but I was using it long before I got here. It's just an excellent editor. And for JavaScript, that is the best editor on the market. If you like WebStorm and IntelliJ, then WebStorm is a great tool to use as well. That would be my backup. Hello, John. Can you brief idea on the folder basic structure recommendation Angular project? Absolutely. It comes out of the box of the CLI. What comes out of there is very easy to use and follow. And if you look at some of the projects of my GitHub page, like the Vikings one, you can see some other recommendations I have. But definitely check out the style guide, which is on the angular.io site. And we give recommendations there too. Why does the service get to decide how it's injected for reuse rather than application root deciding how to compose the dependencies? Because the service itself is what you have to, in the class, you have to tell it that it is a service. And then you can tell it where to inject it. They actually have a way to not do that. This was a newer feature that came out in version 6 or 7 of Angular. It used to be that you just defined the service, and then in the module, you would say, where do you want to provide this? And this was causing some problems. There's a whole list of them that they listed on the blog post, but one of the big ones was by looking at the service alone, you couldn't tell where it was defined and who could use it. So you always had to go find and search through your app, where is it being provided? So now that you can provide it right and tell it where to provide it right inside the service, it makes it easier for the app to know where they are. And your follow-up here is that it feels backwards because it's not really letting the application root decide how to compose the dependencies. And I paraphrase that. And that's true. The application root, it doesn't look like it knows how to compose them, but Angular is smart under the covers. When it's building the whole app out, it looks for these things and it knows and it figures out in advance. Think of it like a 2-pass system. It figures out what services do I have, where are they being provided, let me figure out the dependency trees and the components, and then we go from there. So it actually does all that for you under the covers. It just makes it easier for us to define them. How would you connect to a database? Yes, you could do that very easily. Effectively, what you do is an HTTP call that would interact with the database. So the HTTP call in this case could call an Azure function, maybe a serverless function that goes and talks to the database like Cosmos DB or SQL Server, or you could call like a Node app or an ASP.NET app with Web API, which then talks to a database. Or you call Firebase directly, for example. What about environment-specific settings? Yeah, there's environment files inside the app, and you can use those. For those who aren't familiar, there's environments are basically like dev mode, prod, testing, production. So you can have as many environments as you want, and that's built into the Angular structure, and the CLI gives you 2 out of the box, dev and prod. If you want to set up to render on tablets or phones, can you do that? Yes, you can. Definitely a longer topic, but out of the box, there's some really good features for this. I recommend looking and exploring the PWAs, Progressive Web Apps, that are a feature of Angular on the Angular IO website. It's not necessarily exactly what you're asking, but it will lead you to the same answers. Would you mind going over some best practices for C# developer to learn TypeScript? There's some great courses actually on Pluralsight for TypeScript. I've written one of them. My buddy Dan Walline's written one. And there's some others. I believe there's a C# developers to TypeScript course that Sean Wildermuth wrote, I believe. I also run workshops on this at different conferences if you ever happen to do the same one I'm at. Do you have to have a separate routing file for every component? No, absolutely not. You can have one routing file for your app if it's a small app. In our app we did, and I had multiple routes pointing to the different components. In case of a GET, why would I want to use an observable as opposed to HTTP GET? Maybe I didn't present that totally clear. So the HTTP GET returns the observable. So you are using both of those. HTTP GET doesn't return an array because it's asynchronous. It instead returns an observable which has access to the array. So the GET does the job just fine, as you're saying here, yes, but it returns an observable of the heroes, not the heroes themselves. Can Angular be used with Blazor and WASM? Yes, you could, which is WebAssembly. You can do that, definitely a topic for another day if you wanted to go down that road. Would I use Angular with Blazor? Probably not, personally. I would probably just pick Angular, but you definitely could combine Angular with any WASM technology. What about the map operator? I think you're talking about RxJS. Yeah, so sometimes you're making a call to get data with HTTP GET, and you go across the wire, you get your list of heroes, but you're not, let's say the data comes across and it's not just your heroes array. Maybe it's embedded in some kind of deep object structure like x.data.heroes. The map would allow you to, the map operator with RxJS would allow you to transform that data and basically make it easier to consume. Let's see, a couple of repeat questions. What is the best practice to modularize your application? That's something we'll follow up in the next webinar that we're going to do, which is more of an intermediate or advanced topics for Angular. Is there a license applicable to install Angular CLI and Node? No, there are none of the, well, there's license files, but it's all listed on their websites if you want to check that out at the Angular IO, but there's no concerns as far as installing those. Please explain more about the map. Yep, I did that a little. And what's the pipe? The pipe is a syntax in RxJS, which has some great RxJS courses, one of them by Deborah Kurata up on Pluralsight, which you can check out. RxJS is a very deep topic. For Angular, just for getting data, all you need to know is that if you want to get the data, you just call the get and you get back an observable, and then you can use map to transform it. Pipe is a function which allows you to accept the map command. Gosh, I'd love to go into RxJS today, just don't have time, sorry. When the application is loaded into the browser, is the JavaScript sent all at once or sent from the server in chunks? The app we showed, the Hello World one, was sent all in one shot. But in larger applications, you'll send them in chunks. And how you send those in chunks depends upon how you design your application. I'll be talking more about that. They're called preloading strategies in the follow-up seminar, webinar that we do later this year. I think I'm also talking about that at the NGConf conference, which is in April in Salt Lake City. If you have more than one module, do we add the additional modules to the main app so the application can recognize them? Yes, you can. So there's a way you can create multiple modules and nest those. In the style guide, which I had a hand in writing, I'm a co-author of it, along with many other great people. Up on the Angular IO website, Look for style guide and look for modules, and you can see different ways you can design these. Is it possible to generate all the components and files without using the CLI? To create them by hand, absolutely. To generate them without the CLI, I imagine somebody's created a different CLI generator somewhere, but I'm not sure why you'd want to. The CLI generates all that stuff for you. So if you were going to find something else that did it, it really would be just replicating all the information that the CLI already does for you. So definitely take advantage of the Angular CLI is my recommendation.